In Ace Combat 5, the Project Aces team dropped a lot of massive hints about the lore of their world, and one country was repeatedly at the center of it all. A fictional nation by the name of Belka. A country like this with so many ancient conflicts, long-held grudges against other nations, and long-running conspiracies must have some sort of story to tell. So for the next installment of the Ace Combat franchise, Project Aces decided to create a prequel to the entire Strangereal timeline up to this point, and thus, Ace Combat 0: The Belkan War was born. It's about damn time that I got around to playing this one, and for a lot of longtime Ace Combat fans, this is held as one of, if not the single greatest game in the entire series. So, does Ace Combat 0: The Belkan War live up to all the hype, or is it simply nostalgia from fans who have been playing these games for decades? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 7th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat 0: The Belkan War is a combat flight simulation game developed and published by Namco that was released on the PlayStation 2 in 2006. The story is set during the Belkan War in 1995, setting it 15 years before the events of Ace Combat 5. We play as a mercenary pilot that goes by the call sign Cypher, and in similar fashion to previous player characters in the Ace Combat games, we don't really know much about this guy other than the fact that he's originally from the fictional country of Ustio. And something that I wasn't expecting, but that I noticed immediately on picking up the game, is that the basic gameplay feels almost identical to AC5. And that's because, for all intents and purposes, this is Ace Combat 5. I had no idea before actually sitting down to play the game, but this game was actually developed by a side team within Project Aces while the main team was hard at work on Ace Combat 6. So to allow for more time to work on things like the campaign, the story, and the new mechanics, the team opted to use AC5 as a base, making this feel more like a standalone expansion to Ace Combat 5 than a full-blown sequel of its own. But thankfully, Ace Combat 5 had some really strong core gameplay, so I'm not really gonna complain. And one of the more interesting systems that the team added to the game appeared right away during my playthrough: the non-hostile target system. Throughout the game, there are some ground targets that will be marked on your radar, but will be considered non-hostile. Along with that, occasionally when you're dogfighting with enemy fighters, their plane will be disabled, converting them into a non-hostile target and giving you the option to either finish them off or just let them leave the combat area and live. And this might sound like a very minor addition, but it actually feeds into another new system that can entirely change the way you play through the game, this being the Ace Style system. This system exists to essentially measure out the player's actions over the course of their playthrough and distinguish them as a mercenary, a soldier, or a knight, respectively. If you go out of your way to destroy every non-hostile target and play in a generally merciless fashion, you'll end up on the mercenary end of the spectrum. If you spare all non-hostile targets and play honorably throughout your playthrough, you'll be put into the knight category. And if you adjust on the fly and do a little bit of both depending on your situation, you'll stay within the soldier section in the middle. And what style you fall within determines a fair amount of things in this game, like what enemy aces you'll be able to find within missions, what new aircraft you'll unlock after completing certain missions, and even what paint jobs you can earn throughout the game as well. It's a system that you can entirely ignore if you want, but if you want to unlock everything in the game, you'll have to do a full playthrough while staying within each of these styles, giving players not just a reason to replay the game, but to take a different approach each time through. It's a really fun addition, and just for those of you that are wondering what I might have done, I stayed completely within the mercenary category because I just wanted to blow some shit up. And in terms of presentation, the visuals are a small step up from AC5's. The game largely looks the same, but I did notice that the plane models seem to have some better texture work up close compared to 5, and the lighting across the board in this game feels like a solid step up as well. But the largest improvement in presentation has to be the mid-mission cutscenes. These things have a level of style that the mid-mission scenes in previous games never did, and honestly, some of the most striking memories for me throughout this game come from them. It's not something that's easy to dig a whole lot into and talk to you about specifically, but to put it simply, these are so much more badass than they ever were in the previous games, and I loved them. And of course, everyone's favorite part of Ace Combat's presentation is always the music. Where the last couple entries leaned very heavily into a more heroic sounding orchestral style, Ace Combat Zero kind of takes that idea and flips it on its head. The soundtrack here is still very orchestral, but rather than sounding heroic, it sounds almost grungy. And that's when they stick to the orchestral music in the first place, with a lot of the soundtrack returning to the rock sounds of the first couple games. And of course, everyone who's played this game already knows, but I have to bring it up, the game also brings in a completely new element to the Ace Combat soundtracks: flamenco guitar. It's an incredibly varied soundtrack, and it's probably my personal favorite that the franchise has produced so far. I mean, just listen to how different all these tracks actually sound. And speaking of the music, the encounters with enemy aces feel particularly special in this game. Between the cutscenes introducing them, the epic music that plays specifically for them, and the fact that we get to know not only the name of what squadron we're going up against, but also see their emblems, it all just comes together to make these encounters feel so much more significant. They really shake up the pace of the missions when they appear now in a way that they never quite did before, and they also have a level of personality that the previous games never had for their ace pilots. So ultimately, I was a really big fan of these here. And speaking of missions, another thing that they did to shake things up a bit here was add some missions where you would be able to choose your own objective. These are really interesting because regardless of what you choose, you'll load into the same map and battle as all the other options, but your specific role within that battle will be different. The idea does feel a little undercooked here, with the 3 options available to you every time essentially boiling down to choosing between an air-to-ground mission, an air-to-air mission, or one that has a combination of the two. It's also very likely that the idea was applied in this specific fashion to save on development time, making it so that developers don't need to make extra maps for the other options. But it does have a certain charm of its own this way, and I would be lying if I said that I didn't enjoy it. And while we're still on the topic of missions, the timers are incredibly lenient here. This was especially noticeable after having just played Ace Combat Advance, which had the strictest timers seen in the franchise so far, and especially with me having actually enjoyed the strict time limits imposed by that game, as I felt that it actually forced me into improving my gameplay in a way that the timers in the console Ace Combat games never had before. But here in Zero, I found that I rarely even needed half the time provided to complete these missions, and some missions even gave as long as 30 minutes to complete your objective, which is definitely exceedingly forgiving. With time limits this long, there really isn't much reason to have a time limit at all, so I would definitely like to see the time allowance reduced in future titles. But in terms of returning systems that have improved, unlockable skins for your jets are handled much better here than they have been in the past. Unlockable plane skins have been present since Ace Combat 4, but they've always been locked into being bonuses for your second playthrough and on. But here in Zero, you can actually start earning these right away. In AC4 and 5, you could unlock some of the signature plane skins just by shooting down ace pilots, but the game would only ever spawn these pilots when playing on New Game Plus. But here in Zero, you can start finding these guys in missions immediately. As well as that, I mentioned it earlier, but when you complete the game with a certain ace style, you'll unlock a universal skin that can be applied to every single aircraft in the game. So for example, when I completed my playthrough, I unlocked the mercenary skin for all jets. So not only can you start earning them earlier, but to earn them all, it will take a minimum of 3 playthroughs, meaning there's a lot more to work towards after simply completing the game front to back for those that want to continue playing. You can even unlock the custom paint jobs that your wingmen have, which brings us to a strange downgrade from 5 to 0. While you do have a wingman for the entire game, it's been brought down from a full squad like in 5 to just a single partner in 0. But that's not the downgrade here. Unlike AC5, you can't choose what plane your wingman is going to fly for each mission. I'm not really sure why they would have removed this, as the only reason I can really think of is just to have that distinct paint job that's unique to the character, but I'm not sure if that necessarily justifies the change. I really enjoyed equipping not just my own character, but all of my allies with the right plane for each mission, so it was disappointing to see that removed here. And the wingmen bring me around to one of the more interesting topics for this video, Ace Combat Zero's story. Something that was really unexpected after how story-oriented AC5 was that the story is practically non-existent for the entire first act of the game. I mean seriously, outside of the intro cutscene, there's essentially no world building or character development whatsoever for the entire first third of the game. It felt like whiplash with how important the story has been since Ace Combat 3, but the first act of this game essentially feels like you're playing Air Combat or AC2 again, with the intro cutscene giving you the basic setup and then just letting you run with it for a few missions with nothing thrown in afterwards. But getting into the second act, not only does the story start to become more of a focus, but one of my favorite abandoned mechanics makes a return. In some select missions of Ace Combat 0, the manual resupply mechanic from Ace Combat 4 is available, and you can fly back to base to top up on ammo just like in that game. These missions were rare, and it definitely felt like it was there only when it would otherwise be completely unfair to not have any form of resupplying, but I'm happy to see it return nonetheless. And as a side note, it doesn't feel like running out of missiles was anywhere near as common as in AC5. I'm not sure if that's because there are less targets, or if jets are loaded up with more missiles than in that game, but it definitely felt a lot less common here. And at about the halfway point of the game, I was starting to question why this game was held in such high regard by the community. I mean, sure, it was good, but it wasn't doing anything that necessarily stood out to me compared to the last few games. But just when things started to seem really boring, a goddamn laser cannon from the sky. We need to immediately flee the combat area and get back to base so that command can figure out how we're going to approach the presence of a giant laser cannon going forward. At least that's what I thought would happen until we got sent in to destroy the thing the very next mission. This is definitely a symptom of the game being handled by a smaller team on a smaller budget, something that you'll likely notice is becoming a bit of a pattern in this video, but this thing doesn't have anywhere near the intimidation factor of previous Ace Combat superweapons because of the game's poor pacing here. In AC4, we evade Stonehenge multiple times before finally taking it down. We're also told about Megalith numerous times, with it first being mentioned in the opening cutscene of the game before we finally get to destroy it for the finale. But here, the weapon gets introduced, and within 5 minutes, we're already in the process of destroying it. That being said, it's still fairly epic to destroy a giant laser cannon, but it definitely could have been built up a lot better to increase the suspense of it, and it's not the case of the team not understanding how to do that, as they've done it amazingly in previous games. And while we're starting to get into the story a bit, Project Aces actually took a really interesting approach with how they framed Zero's story. They decided to tell this story to us in the form of a network television documentary, even using live action footage for most of their cutscenes to really sell it. And as cool as this is, the acting in these cutscenes is, well, it's something alright.
B7R, an essential area that we couldn't allow to be violated. That day when I heard the order from HQ for reinforcements, I became angry.
And because of this approach to the storytelling, it leads to a story that's really great for lore and world building, but not all that great for characters. There's only one character in this game who even feels remotely like a real person, and that's our wingman Solo Wing Pixie. Like our character, he's a mercenary from Ustio who's fighting for the Allied forces purely for money. But there's an instance halfway through the game that makes him seriously reconsider his values. We're fighting in a battle much like those we've been taking part in throughout the entire game, but in an act of defiance against the Allied forces, Belka detonates 7 nuclear weapons throughout their own nation to stop our advance. This ends up taking the lives of over 12,000 civilians and makes Solo Wing seriously question his own actions up to this point. And so, he simply says goodbye to us and flies off to who knows where. This, in my opinion, is the only meaningful moment of character writing in the entire game, and it's something that we'll circle back to in a little bit. At about this point in the campaign, I caught something really interesting. Ace Combat Zero has a couple of missions in its campaign that reuse maps from AC5, something that was surely done to save on development time, as well as tie the events of this game into that existing story. But it's particularly interesting to mention here because while only having a couple reused missions might sound like nothing, AC0's campaign is only 18 missions long to begin with, so a little over 10% of the game's maps are reused from the previous game. There's also one new map that they made for Ace Combat Zero that gets used for 3 separate missions, which is even more significant with almost 20% of the game's runtime taking place on a single map. Though, said map is important to the story, so it's not something to harp on too much, just something I thought I'd add to the discussion. But for all of the various issues that Zero's campaign has, if nothing else, it does offer some more of that sweet Belkan superweapon action. I already mentioned the giant laser cannon, but there's also this huge flying fortress that feels shockingly similar to the final boss from Air Combat. And maybe there's even one more that I'll talk about in just a bit. Ever since the original game, these superweapons have always been some of the standout moments from every single entry, and while I think that 5 still does have more superweapons than Zero, I would say that Zero's superweapons are the most visually interesting in the series so far. But strangely, the majority of these weapons aren't actually used by the Belkan military, and are instead used by a renegade group of former Belkan military that goes by A World with No Boundaries. This group suddenly forms after the main Belkan force surrenders at the end of the campaign's second act, and starts its own war with the Allied forces to eliminate all foreign nations in the world, this making up the third act of the game. They believe that if Belka is the only country on the planet, then war would completely cease to exist, and they managed to pull together some of the best fighters from all the countries involved in the Belkan War for their efforts. But even with those super weapons making a return, Ace Combat Zero is probably one of the easiest games in the franchise so far. I rarely got shot down during my playthrough, and beyond that, I got an S rank on almost every single mission on the first attempt. Now again, I do these reviews while playing on normal difficulty, so I can't speak to any of the higher ones just yet, but when comparing these games on normal, this is probably the second easiest of the franchise, only being beaten out by AC2. Except for one thing. Everything I just said about the difficulty is true, but only for the first 15 missions of the game. The last 3 missions are a difficulty spike the likes of which I haven't seen from a game in a long time. Completely out of nowhere, the game goes from I've been shot down once during my entire campaign to a 1v8 dogfight against the toughest aces the developers had to offer, leading to me getting shot down 6 times on one single combat encounter. The subsequent missions aren't quite as tough as this one, but I did crash or get shot down at least once per mission past this point, which is still a considerable step up from the rest of the campaign. After surviving that dogfight, we need to go destroy the enemy's anti-aircraft defenses, which are all tucked away in underground tunnels. So of course, because this is Ace Combat, we send a pilot underground instead of, ground troops, with us diving into, swerving through, and pulling back out of tunnels repeatedly until the entire defense system is wiped out. It's easily the craziest trench run style mission in the entire series so far, and I absolutely adored this one. And after this, we get the final fight of the game. Solo Wing Pixie arrives in a new super fighter with a laser cannon mounted on top of it, revealing that he left us to join A World with No Boundaries, becoming their ace pilot. And so we start to fight with him, the 2 greatest pilots in the skies going back and forth launching missiles, firing machine guns, and laser beams, until we finally manage to shoot him down, ending the conflict and A World with No Boundaries for good. Now, I'm just going to rip the band-aid off straight away. I think that the story in Ace Combat Zero is fine, but it just didn't have the effect on me that the stories of 3, 4, and 5 did. I personally enjoy my stories to be much more character-driven, and Zero's story is perfectly okay, but it's almost entirely based around lore and world building, so I personally didn't get a whole lot out of it. One good thing to come from it though is that unlike AC5, the story never intrudes on the actual gameplay, which will definitely make Zero much easier to replay over and over again. Overall, I really enjoyed Ace Combat Zero, but I'd be lying to you if I said I enjoyed it more than the other PS2 entries. While the core gameplay is still incredibly strong, and replayability and music are probably at their all-time peak for the franchise, everything outside of that just feels like a step back. If this game had retained AC5's mission variety and storytelling along with its gameplay, it would probably stand as the peak for me, but looking at it as a total package, it just feels like the weakest of this trilogy. That being said though, being the weakest of the PS2 trilogy of Ace Combat is certainly far from being a bad game, and at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat Zero: The Belkan War an 8.3. And with that, we're finally done with the holy trinity of Ace Combat. I hope you guys enjoyed, and thank you for stopping by for another video. The fact that you guys keep coming back really motivates me to continue on with the series and see it through to the end, so seriously, thank you for watching all the way through. If you guys are interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. It starts as low as $1 a month, has a ton of benefits tied to it, and it really goes a long way in helping me put as much time as possible into these videos, and I can't thank you guys enough. If you want to check out the other videos in the series, you can find them right here, and maybe even check out another series we've been doing recently here on the channel reviewing the Metal Gear games. But until next time, I'll see you guys right here for the next Ace Combat review.